In a world where power often speaks louder than kindness, one small act of courage can change everything. This is a story of a young girl, a devoted worker, and a man who thought he had everything until he realized he was losing what mattered most. It's a journey of pain, forgiveness, and the quiet strength that comes when we choose compassion over control. Stay with us as we unfold the story of change, redemption, and the power of the human heart. Victor L. Renard had built his empire from the ground up. A self-made billionaire, he was known for his sharp mind and unyielding determination. But success had come at a price. Over the years, the pressure to maintain his wealth and influence had slowly worn away the compassion and patience he once possessed. Now, he was a man defined by his ambition, focused solely on the expansion of his power and wealth. To him, the world was a battlefield, and only the strongest survived. That morning, the golden light of the sun barely touched the corners of the grand mansion as the servants bustled about preparing for another day of business meetings and social obligations. The Renard estate stood proudly on a hill, surrounded by manicured gardens and the quiet hum of an opulent life. The staff worked tirelessly, but no one felt the weight of their labor more than Mrs. Elena. At 55, Mrs. Elena was no stranger to hard work. She had served the Renard family for almost a decade, waking before dawn each day to clean the sprawling rooms and polished marble floors of the mansion. Her body, now aging, had begun to feel the toll of the years, but she pushed through, driven by the need to care for her ailing husband and provide for her children. Her life was one of sacrifice, but she never complained. Her dedication to the family she worked for was unwavering, until that day. It was late morning when Mrs. Elena arrived at the mansion, her tired eyes clouded with worry. Her husband, Marcos, had been bedridden for the past few days, his condition worsening. She had struggled to get him settled, but something had kept her from leaving the house on time. The phone call she had received from the hospital had been a reminder of his deteriorating health. She had to make sure he was comfortable before leaving for work. But now, she was late. As she stepped into the grand foyer, the harsh voice of Victor L. Renard cut through the air like a whip. His tall, imposing figure loomed near the entrance, his stern face twisted in anger. He was impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, his cold blue eyes narrowing as he saw her. "You're late," he said, his voice icy and filled with authority. Mrs. Elena immediately felt a tightening in her chest. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Renard," she began, her voice trembling with embarrassment. "There was a problem with my husband's health. I had to." "I don't care about your excuses, Elena," Victor interrupted, his tone sharp, as though he had no time for anything other than perfection. "This house runs on time, and if you can't respect that, then you're no use to me." He advanced toward her, his anger mounting with every word. The power he wielded was palpable, and Mrs. Elena, small and fragile in comparison, could only stand frozen before him, her heart racing in fear and frustration. "You think you can just waltz in here whenever you please?" He spat, his voice rising. "You work for me, and that means you follow my rules. This is not a charity." Mrs. Elena, her hands trembling at her sides, opened her mouth to explain, but no words came out. She knew there was no use. Victor Renard had no sympathy for weakness, no patience for the struggles of others. She had seen it in his eyes countless times before. He was a man of absolute control, and those who did not meet his standards were quickly discarded. Victor's face twisted into a sneer as he grabbed the switch from the nearby coat rack. He swung it harshly through the air, his anger unchecked. The sound of it cutting through the air sent a jolt of fear through Mrs. Elena's body. "You will learn discipline," he growled. Before she could react, the sharp sting of the switch hit her back, the pain radiating through her body. Mrs. Elena winced, her breath catching in her throat as tears welled up in her eyes. This wasn't the first time she had faced his cruelty, but it felt different today. It felt like a breaking point. Victor's anger continued to rage as he struck again, the switch making contact with her fragile skin. The humiliation of the moment consumed her. Each strike, a reminder that in his eyes, she was nothing more than an expendable servant. She did not matter. Her struggles did not matter. In the corner of the room, hidden from view, Leila Renard stood silently, her wide eyes fixed on the scene unfolding before her. She had been walking down the grand staircase, heading for the breakfast table, when the angry voices reached her ears. Curiosity had drawn her to the top of the stairs, and she had peered down, barely daring to breathe as she watched the harsh punishment. Lila's heart raced in her chest as she saw her father strike Mrs. Elena again. She had never seen him act like this before. Her father was a man of power and control, but this cruelty was something else. She could not understand it. Her eyes flicked between the woman being struck and her father's cold, merciless face. A wave of shock and disbelief washed over her, leaving her speechless. The pain of seeing Mrs. Elena, a woman who had always been kind to her, treated with such brutality was too much to bear. Lila felt her chest tighten, the blood rushing in her ears. She wanted to scream, to do something, anything, but she remained frozen, her small body trembling in place. Finally, Victor's anger seemed to dissipate, and he dropped the switch. Without a word, he turned on his heel and stormed out of the room, leaving Mrs. Elena standing there, her back bruised, tears streaming down her face. She didn't dare to make a sound, though her entire body shook with silent sobs. Lila stood there for what felt like an eternity, her breath shallow, her mind spinning. She had witnessed something terrible, something that shattered the illusion she had of her father. She had always admired him, trusted him, but now as she looked at the broken woman below her, she felt a wave of guilt wash over her. She should have done something. She should have stopped it. But all she could do was watch. And in that moment, Lila knew nothing would ever be the same again. Mrs. Elena stood in the silence of the grand foyer, her body trembling from the pain of the switch, her heart aching from the harshness of her employer's words. But even in the midst of her suffering, the feeling that weighed most heavily on her wasn't the sting on her back, but the crushing weight of her responsibility, the overwhelming burden of her family's needs, her own health, and the relentless demands of her work. For nearly a decade, Mrs. Elena had dedicated herself to the Renard family, rising before the sun each day to ensure their mansion was spotless, their lives unburdened by the mundane tasks of the everyday world. She was more than a cleaner to them. She was a fixture in the vast estate, an invisible hand that kept the house running smoothly, day in and day out. She had learned to navigate the sprawling rooms with an almost instinctual grace, wiping down marble counters, polishing glass chandeliers, and ensuring that the Reynards' world of opulence remained pristine. But as much as she had devoted herself to the family, her own life was anything but perfect. She was 55, and the years had started to show. Her back ached from the repetitive motions of cleaning floors that seemed endless. Her hands had grown stiff with arthritis, and the relentless demands of her job only made it harder to keep up. Yet she kept going. She had no choice. Her family depended on her. Her husband, Marcos, was gravely ill. He had been diagnosed with a heart condition years ago, and despite all the medication and care, his health had been slowly declining. Recently, his condition had worsened. The coughing fits were more frequent, the weakness more apparent, and the doctors had given him little hope. He had stopped leaving the house, now confined to their small apartment in the city, a far cry from the lavish life of the Reynards. Elena had to be there for him, tending to his needs, making sure he ate, giving him his medication, and holding him when the pain was unbearable. It was exhausting work, but she loved him deeply, and she couldn't bear to leave him alone for long. This morning, as with many others, she had struggled to balance her duties at home with her obligations to the Reynard family. Marcos had woken up early, barely able to get out of bed, and she had spent over an hour helping him manage his condition. The doctor had come by for a brief checkup, but the prognosis had been grim. "His heart is weakening faster than we expected," the doctor had said, his voice kind but laced with concern. "Make him comfortable." That phrase echoed in her mind as she tried to gather her things and leave for work. She had promised Marcos she would be back before midday, but she had barely gotten through the door when she realized she was late. She had wanted to be punctual. She always did. But the reality of her husband's illness, coupled with the pressure of making sure everything was in place at home, had delayed her. She had called the house, explaining that she was running late. But she knew better than to expect sympathy from Mr. Renard. He didn't understand. He didn't need to understand. To him, punctuality was a measure of value, of competence, and her tardiness, no matter the reason, would be seen as a personal failure, a breach of the strict standards he demanded. As she stood there, the remnants of the switch's sting on her skin, she felt the familiar pang of helplessness. She was just one woman, one tired, aging woman trying to juggle the impossible. The Renard family was her lifeline, the only thing keeping her afloat, but their cruelty today had left her feeling more invisible than ever. She had tried to explain, but it was useless. There was no compassion for her struggle. There never had been. Victor Renard, with all his wealth and power, never saw the late-night hours she spent caring for her husband. He never witnessed the endless pain she had endured to hold her family together. All he saw was the late arrival, the unpolished floor, the missed minute, and that was enough to strip her of her dignity. But Mrs. Alina wasn't angry. Not at him, at least. She was angry at the world. The world that had forced her into this position, where she had to sacrifice her own health and well-being for the sake of a job, for the sake of her family. She had accepted it, silently, because she had no other choice. Her husband needed her, and her children depended on her. What else could she do but keep going? The punishment had left her shaken, her back aching, but it wasn't the physical pain that lingered. It was the emotional toll. The reminder that no matter how hard she worked, no matter how loyal she would always be beneath him. She would always be just a cleaner in his eyes, just a servant, just someone to be used. She took a slow, steadying breath and wiped the tears from her eyes. She couldn't afford to break down. Not now. Not here. She had a job to do, and the Renards would expect nothing less than perfection when it came to their home. As she moved to gather her cleaning supplies and continue her work, her thoughts were consumed with the fear that she would soon be replaced. The thought of losing this job, the only one she had been able to keep for so many years, was unbearable. It wasn't just about the money. It was about her dignity, her sense of purpose. Without it, she feared she would have nothing left to give. But no matter how much she wanted to collapse under the weight of it all, she couldn't. She had made a promise to herself, to her family, that she would continue to fight. She would endure the silent pain. She would endure the cruel words, the harsh punishments. She would keep her head down, keep working, because it was the only way to survive. She walked down the long hallway, past the towering columns and polished marble floors. The house seemed empty now, the silence oppressive. The only sounds were the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner and the muffled echo of her footsteps as she prepared to face another day. Another day of invisible labor. Another day of sacrifice. As she entered the grand kitchen to begin her tasks, Mrs. Elena caught a glimpse of her reflection in the ornate silver mirror that adorned the wall. For a moment, she barely recognized the woman staring back at her. The years had not been kind, but it was more than that. There was something in her eyes now, a weariness, a resignation that hadn't been there before. She had given so much of herself, and yet, for all her effort, she felt like nothing more than a shadow in the Renard household. And that thought lingered with her throughout the day. The sting of the punishment, the bitterness of the injustice, it would remain with her, buried deep inside, as she continued to clean the mansion's endless halls, waiting for the moment when it would all finally break. The switch landed sharply against Mrs. Elena's back, a sudden jolt of discomfort that made her flinch. Her body instinctively tensed, but she couldn't escape the blow. Each strike came quickly, and with each one the sting deepened, not just in her body, but in her heart. Victor Renard's frustration had built to a boiling point, and his words were sharp, biting at the air around her. "You think you can just show up late and everything will be fine?" His voice was low, filled with irritation. "Do you think your excuses matter?" The switch came down again, striking her arms and legs, the discomfort intensifying with every hit. Mrs. Elena felt each blow deeply, not just physically, but emotionally. Years of service, countless sacrifices, sleepless nights caring for her ailing husband, long days cleaning the mansion, all seemed to fade into nothingness in this moment. To Victor Renard, she seemed like just another part of his world, something that could be replaced at any moment. Mrs. Elena's breath caught with each strike, her body trembling from the physical pain. But what hurt most was the quiet realization that after all these years, she seemed to have little value to the man she had served faithfully. Tears welled in her eyes, but she held them back. knowing that showing emotion would only make things worse. She clenched her jaw and endured, praying for the moment when it would stop. But it didn't stop. Victor's frustration seemed endless, and his anger continued to pour out. It wasn't just her body that he struck, but something deeper inside her, as though he wanted to erase everything she had ever given. She was left feeling small, insignificant, as if she didn't matter at all. Through her blurred vision, Mrs. Elena saw the switch rise again, but it wasn't the physical pain that overwhelmed her. It was the coldness in Victor's eyes. The lack of understanding, the absence of any kindness. It was a look that told her everything she needed to know. She meant nothing to him. What truly saddened her, though, wasn't the punishment itself. It was the realization that she had no choice but to stay. Her family needed this job. She couldn't leave, no matter how much it hurt. But in that moment, she wished she could. She wished she could escape this house, this situation, and be free from the cruelty of it all. Then, through the silence, she heard it. A faint rustling from behind the staircase, a soft sound that could easily have been overlooked. The sound of shallow, rapid breathing. Mrs. Elena's heart stopped for a second as her mind struggled to understand what was happening. It was Lila. Lila, Victor's daughter, had been watching from behind the stairs. She had seen everything. The way her father had raised his hand to someone who had always been kind to her. Lila had witnessed the whole scene in silence. Victor, still caught up in his anger, was unaware of his daughter's presence. He continued his tirade, his words harsh, but Mrs. Elena's thoughts were no longer focused on him. They were with Lila. How could the child understand what she had just witnessed? How could she process the actions of the man she had always looked up to, the man who was supposed to protect her, now showing such cruelty? The switch came down once more, and though Mrs. Elena flinched, her attention was on Lila. In that brief moment, her heart broke for the child. She didn't want Lila to have to carry this memory with her. She didn't want her to see this side of her father. But it was already too late. Lila had seen it all. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Victor's anger seemed to have exhausted itself. He stepped back, his breath heavy, and for a moment it seemed like he was satisfied with the punishment. He had restored order in his mind. Without saying a word, he turned and stormed out of the room, leaving behind a thick silence. The quiet that followed felt overwhelming, like a weight pressing down on Mrs. Elena's chest. She remained standing in the center of the room, physically aching, emotionally drained, and utterly alone. Lila, still hidden behind the staircase, was motionless, unable to process what she had just seen. She had witnessed everything, the way her father had treated Mrs. Elena, the harshness of his actions, and the complete lack of compassion. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of it, but it felt impossible. Her father had always been a figure of authority, someone she admired and looked up to. How could he act this way? How could the man who had always protected her now be the cause of so much pain? The tears Lila had been holding back finally began to fall, but she remained silent. She had watched, paralyzed, unable to stop what was happening, unable to say anything. How could this be the same man who had comforted her, who had cheered her on in every small victory? How could he be the one to hurt someone she cared about? Her heart ached as she continued to watch Mrs. Elena, still standing, her hands clutching her back as she tried to steady herself. The woman's shoulders trembled, her head hung low, and the dignity she had once carried so proudly was now in tatters. It was a moment Lila would never forget. But what could she do? How could a 12-year-old girl intervene when the one causing harm was her father, the man who controlled everything? How could she confront him when he was the one who had hurt someone she cared about? Lila felt a mix of emotions, fear, confusion, and guilt, as she stood frozen, unsure of what to do next. She wanted to comfort Mrs. Elena, to tell her that this wasn't right, that it wasn't her fault. But her body wouldn't move, her voice was stuck in her throat, and the overwhelming sense of helplessness kept her in place. It wasn't until the sound of Victor's footsteps faded down the hall that Lila finally found the courage to step out from behind the staircase. Her heart felt heavy with guilt as she looked at Mrs. Elena, still standing, still trying to maintain some composure despite the pain. Lila wanted to rush to her, to offer comfort, but the space between them felt too wide. Instead, Lila remained still, unable to speak, unable to act. The weight of what she had just witnessed hung in the air, and the mansion, usually so grand and filled with life, now felt empty. Lila stood there, lost in thought, unable to escape the knowledge that her world had just shifted, and that nothing would ever be the same. This moment, this memory, would stay with her forever. Lila stood in the shadow of the grand staircase, her small body trembling, her eyes locked on the spot where Victor had just stormed out. Her father's footsteps still echoed in her mind, reverberating through her thoughts with an unnerving finality. The weight of what she had just witnessed pressed down on her chest, suffocating her with the unbearable reality that her father, the man she had always admired, the man she thought she knew, was capable of such cruelty. The house, once a place of comfort, felt eerily silent now. The usual sounds, the soft hum of the air conditioning, the gentle clink of silverware being set for dinner, had all faded into a deep, hollow quiet. Lila stood motionless, the images of her father's rage and Mrs. Alina's broken form playing over and over in her mind like a nightmare she couldn't escape. She had never seen her father so angry. Never. He was a man of control, a man who demanded perfection in everything. But he had always been kind to her, always protective, always careful with his words. He was the father who read to her at night, who held her when she had nightmares, who praised her for every achievement, no matter how small. He had always been her hero. But what kind of hero strikes a woman, an elderly woman, with a switch? What kind of father treats someone who has served him faithfully for nearly a decade like that? Mrs. Elena wasn't just a maid to Lila. She was a part of the family in a way. She had always been kind, always patient, always willing to listen. Mrs. Elena was the one who had braided her hair when Lila was younger, who had stayed up late with her during her first sleepover at the mansion, and who had patiently explained how to polish the fine china. She was a woman Lila admired, a woman who had shown her nothing but respect and kindness. How could her father do this to her? Lila's heart clenched, the guilt rising like a tide, drowning her thoughts. Why hadn't she done something? Why hadn't she screamed? Why hadn't she run to Mrs. Elena's side and stopped him? But she hadn't moved. She hadn't said a word. She had stood there, frozen, too shocked to do anything at all. She had just watched, helpless, as the woman she cared for was punished, and all she could do was hold her breath and pray it would end. But it had ended, and it was too late. Her father had left the room without a second glance at Mrs. Elena, his coldness settling over everything. She had heard the door slam behind him, heard his angry footsteps fade down the hallway. And now, in the silence that followed, all Lila could hear was the sound of her own heartbeat, pounding in her ears, a constant reminder of how small and powerless she had felt in that moment. She glanced at Mrs. Elena, still standing in the middle of the foyer, her back hunched in pain, her hands pressed against her sides. The elderly woman was trying to compose herself, but Lila could see the tears pooling in her eyes, could see the way her shoulders trembled. It was as if every ounce of strength that Mrs. Elena had was being drained from her in that one agonizing moment. Lila's heart broke for her. She wanted to run to her, to apologize, to say something, anything, to make it better. But she couldn't. The words caught in her throat, tangled in the web of fear and confusion that had wrapped itself around her heart. What could she say? What could she do to make it right? The questions echoed in her mind, each one more impossible than the last. She felt helpless. The world felt like it was crumbling around her, and she didn't know how to hold it together. But what disturbed her the most was the growing sense of disillusionment inside her. Her father, the man who had always been her rock, had just shown her a side of himself she had never known existed. How could he treat someone so harshly, so callously? Didn't he care? Didn't he see how wrong it was? Didn't he realize that Mrs. Elena had a life outside this house, a family, a husband who was sick, and children who relied on her? Lila felt a deep sadness settle in her chest, a sadness that went beyond the injustice of what had happened. It was a sadness that seemed to swallow her whole. She was angry at her father for what he had done, but she was also angry at herself for not speaking up, for not standing up for what was right. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides. What do I do now? She asked herself, her mind racing. She couldn't just forget what she had seen. She couldn't just go back to her life as if nothing had happened. There was no way to undo the damage, no way to unsee the cruelty her father had shown. It was a moment that would stay with her forever, a wound that would never heal. But what could she do? She was only a child, only 12 years old. She had no power, no voice in a world dominated by her father's authority. But deep inside, something stirred, a quiet, growing sense of rebellion. Mrs. Elena deserved better. She deserved respect. She deserved to be treated with kindness, not like some disposable object to be discarded when it was inconvenient. And Lila couldn't let it go. She couldn't just stand by and do nothing. She had to make her father see, had to make him understand that what he had done was wrong. But how? Lila knew her father better than anyone. She knew his temper, his pride, his need for control. Confronting him directly would be pointless. It would only make things worse. But maybe, just maybe, there was another way. She couldn't change the past, but she could change how he saw things. She could make him realize that his actions had consequences, that the people he hurt weren't invisible. But would he listen? Would he even care? The thought of speaking up, of challenging her father in any way, made her feel small and insignificant. He was powerful. He had always been the one in control, the one who dictated the rules of their world. She was just his daughter, a child. What did she know about the real world? What could she say that would make a difference? But then, in that quiet, still moment, as she stood there watching Mrs. Elena, Lila made a decision. She wasn't going to let her father's actions define who she was. She wasn't going to let the injustice go unchallenged. She would find a way to make him see the truth, no matter how hard it would be. It wouldn't be easy. It wouldn't be quick, but she would do it, even if it meant facing the anger and disappointment of the only man she had ever trusted. Lila turned her gaze toward Mrs. Elena, who had straightened up by now, her back still stiff, but her tears wiped away. She was trying to recover, trying to be strong, just as she always had been. Lila swallowed hard, taking a tentative step forward. "Mrs. Elena," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. The older woman turned, her eyes wide in surprise. For a moment, there was a flicker of recognition in her eyes, a flicker of warmth, but it was quickly replaced by something else, something that Lila couldn't quite place. A kind of quiet resignation, perhaps. She had seen it before, but now it seemed different. "I'm sorry," Lila whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm so sorry." Mrs. Elena said nothing. She just gave her a sad, knowing smile, one that Lila would carry with her for the rest of her life. And as the weight of the world seemed to settle around her once more, Lila knew that the road ahead would be difficult, that the confrontation she dreaded was coming. But one thing was certain. She couldn't let it go. Not now. Not ever. The evening descended slowly over the Renard mansion, its grandeur amplified by the soft glow of crystal chandeliers hanging from the high ceilings. The polished dining table gleamed in the dim light, set with precision, every utensil aligned perfectly. A quiet elegance filled the room, the kind of stillness that often accompanied dinner in the Renard household, where conversations were polite and kept to safe, meaningless topics. It was a ritual Lila had long grown used to, a ritual that now felt suffocating, heavy with unspoken words. She sat at the far end of the table, her small frame swallowed by the vastness of the chair. Her father, as always, sat at the head, his posture rigid, his eyes scanning through papers even as he ate. His face was a mask of focus, his sharp features set in a way that made it clear he was not to be disturbed. The only sounds were the soft clinking of silverware and the rhythmic hum of the mansion's ventilation system. Lila's stomach churned as she stared at her plate, her appetite gone. Her mind was elsewhere, on the pain she had witnessed earlier, on Mrs. Elena's broken form, on the suffocating silence that had followed her father's outburst. But most of all, it was on the burning need to speak, to confront the man who had caused that pain. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind 1,000 times, each time more fearful, more unsure. But tonight she couldn't stay silent. She couldn't ignore what she had seen, what she knew to be wrong. The soft clink of her fork against her plate shattered the quiet, and her father's eyes flickered up briefly, his gaze cool and dismissive. "Is something wrong, Lila?" he asked, his tone as detached as ever. Lila hesitated, her breath catching in her throat. She had never defied him before. She had never challenged him, never questioned his authority, but everything inside her was telling her that this was the moment. She couldn't let the silence stretch any longer. "No," she said, her voice shaking slightly. I just want to talk to you." Victor Renard raised an eyebrow, putting down his glass of wine. "Talk about what?" Lila felt her pulse quicken. She wanted to run, wanted to hide, but she steeled herself. This had to be done. "About what happened this morning," she said, her voice trembling despite her effort to sound calm. Her father's expression shifted slightly, his eyes narrowing ever so slightly. "Leela, we've already discussed this. Mrs. Elena was late, and I handled it. There's nothing more to say." His voice was cold, clipped, and the finality of it stung. But Leela's voice grew stronger as she pressed on. "No, it's not okay. You hurt her, father. You hurt her in front of me, in front of everyone. She didn't deserve that." Victor's eyes flashed with irritation, and for a moment, Leela thought he might dismiss her completely. He set his utensils down and leaned back in his chair, his face turning into a mask of indifference. "She was late, Leela," he said, as though the explanation were self-evident, as if his actions were justified by the rules of the house. "Discipline is important. Without it, there's chaos." "Discipline?" Layla's voice cracked with emotion. "She's been working for us for years. She's loyal. She's kind. She's treated me like family. And you hit her, father. She was late because her husband is sick. She didn't deserve to be treated like that." Victor's lips thinned, his eyes hardening. "Lila, you don't understand how the world works. The world doesn't run on kindness. It runs on order, on structure. Without discipline, people become weak. I don't have time for weakness, not in my business, and certainly not in my home." Lila's hands clenched into fists under the table, her knuckles turning white with the effort to keep herself composed. "And what about Mrs. Elena? Is she weak because she has a sick husband? Is she weak because she cares about her family? What kind of man treats someone like that? Someone who has been nothing but loyal?" Victor's expression hardened, his eyes growing colder, but Leela wasn't finished. She could feel the words burning in her chest, demanding to be spoken. "You always say you care about loyalty, that you reward it, but you didn't reward her today. You punished her. And it wasn't because she did anything wrong. It was because you were angry, and you took it out on her. You didn't care about the reason she was late. You just wanted to show her who was in charge." The silence that followed was heavy, the air thick with tension. Victor's face was a mask, but Lila could see the tightness in his jaw, the way his hands gripped the arms of his chair. For a moment, it felt like the whole room had frozen, as though time itself had stopped, holding its breath. Victor leaned forward, his voice low and measured, though the anger was still simmering beneath the surface. "Lila, I won't have you lecturing me on how to run my household. I understand that you're upset, but you need to understand that sometimes harsh measures are necessary. Mrs. Elena is a servant in this house, and she must know her place." Lila recoiled at the words, the coldness of them sending a shiver through her. Her place? She had never once thought of Mrs. Elena as anything less than a person deserving of respect. The woman had been a constant presence in her life, offering kindness when no one else would. She had never once treated her like she was beneath her. "How can you say that?" Lila's voice broke, and for the first time, the tears she had been holding back began to spill. "How can you treat someone like that when you know what she's going through? How can you not see how wrong it is?" Victor's expression faltered, his eyes briefly betraying a flicker of something, guilt, perhaps, or discomfort, but it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. He straightened, the wall of control around him reinforcing itself. "Lila," he said, his tone softer but still firm, "you're not seeing the bigger picture. This world isn't kind, and if you want to survive in it, you have to learn how to make tough decisions. Not everyone is going to be treated equally. Not everyone is worthy of kindness." The words hung in the air between them like poison, and Lila could feel the distance growing wider, the gap between who her father was and who she thought he was becoming impossible to bridge. She had expected resistance, but she had never expected this complete disregard for the human cost of his actions. For a moment, Layla was silent, the weight of her emotions threatening to overwhelm her. She wanted to scream, to make him understand how deeply wrong he was. But instead, she took a deep breath, wiping her tears away, and spoke again, her voice quieter but no less determined. "She is worthy," Lila said, her words steady now. She's worthy of kindness, and you're wrong. You're wrong, Father. Victor stared at her, his expression unreadable. The room was silent for a long moment, the tension thick and suffocating. Finally, he stood, pushing his chair back with a sharp scrape against the floor. This conversation is over, Leela. His voice was cold, final. You don't understand what it takes to lead, but you will someday. Lila's heart sank, but she held her ground. Maybe I'll never understand, but I know what's right, and I know what's wrong. Victor's eyes flashed with anger, but he didn't say anything more. He turned on his heel, his footsteps heavy as he left the room, leaving Leela alone at the table, her mind racing. The silence that followed was deafening. Lila sat there, her chest tight, the echo of her father's words ringing in her ears. She had hoped for a different outcome, had hoped he would listen, but deep down, she had known he wouldn't. He was too entrenched in his own beliefs, too convinced that his way was the only way. But for the first time in her life, Lila wasn't afraid to challenge him. For the first time, she had stood up for what was right, and she felt something shift inside her, a quiet strength, a resolve that she hadn't known she was capable of. As the door clicked shut behind her father, Lila took a deep breath and wiped her eyes. She might not have won this battle, but the war wasn't over. She would fight for what was right, no matter the cost. The silence that followed Victor Renard's departure from the dining room was deafening. The soft clinking of silverware, the hum of the refrigerator in the far corner, the distant sound of the wind rustling against the tall windows, everything felt distant, muted. Lila sat alone at the long, polished table, her hands still gripping the edge, the sting of her father's dismissal like a burn on her skin. She had never seen him so resolute, so cold in the face of her pain. For a moment, Lila wondered if she had imagined the brief flicker of doubt in his eyes, that small crack in his otherwise impenetrable mask. But the more she thought about it, the more it seemed like a fleeting moment, something her mind had conjured out of hope, not reality. Victor was a man who lived by his rules. He believed in the power of control, of order, of discipline. He always had. His world was one built on these principles. A world where kindness was a weakness and compassion was a luxury that could not be afforded. And now, as she sat there, feeling the weight of his words pressing down on her, Lila understood the harsh truth. He would never see things the way she did. He would never value empathy over power. Her chest tightened with the realization. She had hoped, no, she had believed, that if she just spoke her truth, he would see the error of his ways. That he would recognize the hurt he had caused and, at the very least, try to make amends. But instead, he had dismissed her. He had turned his back on the very idea that his actions were wrong, and in doing so, he had reinforced everything that had always made him who he was. The words he had spoken replayed in her mind. The world doesn't run on kindness. The world runs on order, on structure, on control. She had known her father as a man of power, a man who commanded respect, who built his empire with a steady hand and a firm will. But now, more than ever, she saw how that power, his need for control, had consumed him. He no longer saw people as individuals with lives and struggles of their own. He saw them as tools, as means to an end. Mrs. Elena was a servant, a cog in the machine. Her suffering had no value to him beyond its inconvenience. Lila's eyes stung, the weight of it all crashing over her like a wave she couldn't stop. She had tried, with every ounce of courage she could muster, to make him see the truth. But the truth had been swallowed by his pride, by his rigid belief that weakness had no place in his world. What can I do? She thought, her mind swirling with frustration. What else can I do to make him understand? She had stood up to him, faced him with the full force of her beliefs, and yet she had walked away from that conversation feeling smaller than ever. Her father's rejection was like a shadow that followed her everywhere now, reminding her that for all her courage, for all her attempts to speak the truth, she was still just a child in a world where power and control reigned supreme. But even as the heavy weight of doubt pressed down on her, another part of her refused to let go. Something inside her, something deeper than the pain and the frustration, told her she couldn't give up. Not yet. There was still a way to make him see. She just had to figure out how. The days that followed were suffused with a quiet tension. The mansion felt colder, the air heavier. Lila tried to focus on her schoolwork, on the routine that had once felt like a comfort, but her thoughts kept drifting back to the conversation with her father, to his cold dismissal, to his conviction that kindness and compassion had no place in his world. The house felt empty without the usual noise, the laughter of the staff, the soft chatter at dinner. Mrs. Elena, though present in the mansion, had become almost invisible in the wake of the incident. Lila would catch glimpses of her moving silently through the hallways, her eyes downcast, her posture hunched with the weight of both her physical pain and her emotional hurt. Lila wanted to reach out to her, to tell her that she didn't deserve any of it, that what had happened wasn't her fault. But each time she saw Mrs. Elena, the words caught in her throat, swallowed by the fear of making things worse. And then, there were the moments when Lila would catch her father's gaze across the dinner table, or in the hallway, or in the library, and for the briefest of seconds, she would see something like uncertainty flicker in his eyes. It was fleeting, just a small crack in the armor he had built around himself. But it was enough to keep Lila's hope alive, even if just for a moment. But the next time they spoke, if they spoke, would he be any different? Would he listen? No, she thought, closing her eyes. Not unless I make him see. Not unless I show him that I can't accept this, that I won't stand by and let him hurt people without understanding the consequences. The silence between them grew. Lila spent hours in her room, lost in thought, trying to find a way to break through the wall of indifference her father had built around himself. But each plan she devised, each approach she considered, felt like it would only push him further away. What good was it to argue with a man who didn't believe in compassion? What good was it to try to make him see a truth that he refused to acknowledge? Her heart sank with the weight of it all. Was this the way it had to be? Would she be forever trapped in a house with a father who could not see the value in kindness? Would she be forced to live in a world where her own beliefs were silenced by his iron grip on everything around him? But even as the questions gnawed at her, even as the doubt clouded her mind, Lila knew that she couldn't let go of what she had seen. She couldn't let go of Mrs. Elena's face, of the way the older woman had looked at her after the punishment. She couldn't let go of the fact that her father had failed to see that his cruelty, his need for control, had hurt someone who had only ever given the best of herself. No matter how much her father denied it, no matter how much he insisted that his way was the only way, Lila knew that she couldn't accept that as the truth. She couldn't let him shape her into someone who didn't care. The struggle between them, the silence that hung in the air, was becoming unbearable. But Lila was resolute now. She would fight for what was right, for the kindness that was buried under the weight of her father's iron-fisted control. She wasn't sure how, and she wasn't sure when, but she would find a way to make him understand. She couldn't give up now, not when Mrs. Elena, and so many others like her, deserved better. The days passed in a blur, each one more suffocating than the last. The mansion, once a place of comfort, now felt like a gilded cage, its silence pressing down on Lila's chest, constricting her every breath. Her father's absence of understanding, his stubborn insistence on control, had left a wound that refused to heal. Despite the confrontation at dinner, nothing had changed. Mrs. Elena still walked through the halls like a shadow of her former self, and her father, Victor Renard, remained distant, impervious to the moral weight of his actions. The conversation with her father had left Lila feeling more isolated than ever, caught between two worlds. The one she had grown up in, shaped by her father's beliefs of power and control, and the one she knew in her heart to be right, a world where kindness mattered, where compassion had real value. And now, more than ever, Lila felt the need for guidance. Someone who could help her navigate the chasm that had opened between her and her father. Her mother, Elise Renard, was always the softer, more nurturing presence in the family, the one who understood Lila's heart, who spoke to her with warmth and gentleness when her father's icy authority became too much. But Elise was away on a business trip, her presence a distant comfort at best. Lila had tried to reach out to her a few times over the last couple of days, but her mother's work commitments had kept her busy, and it was only that evening, after yet another strained dinner with her father, that Lila found a quiet moment to pick up the phone and call her mother. Her fingers trembled as she dialed Elise's number, the familiar sound of the ring echoing in her ears. She had rehearsed what she would say, but as the phone continued to ring, her thoughts scattered. What if her mother didn't understand? What if she sided with her father? The fear of being rejected by the one person she felt might support her made her heart race. Finally, the call connected and her mother's warm voice came through the receiver. "Lila? Sweetheart, is everything okay?" Leela took a shaky breath, her chest tight with the weight of everything she had to say. "Mom," she began, her voice low, "I need to talk to you. I don't know who else to turn to." "Of course, darling," Elise said immediately, her tone filled with concern. "What's wrong?" Lila's mind raced as she gathered her thoughts. She needed to explain everything. The way her father had treated Mrs. Alina, the punishment, the way he had dismissed her when she tried to confront him, and the overwhelming sense of helplessness she now felt. She told her mother everything, her words tumbling out in a rush, each one laced with the raw emotion she had been carrying for days. "Mom," Lila said, her voice quivering, "he hurt her. Mrs. Elena, she didn't deserve it. I saw it, I felt it, and I couldn't do anything. And when I tried to talk to him about it, he just shut me down. He said that the world doesn't run on kindness, that discipline is more important than anything. And Mom, I don't understand how he could say that. How could he hurt someone like that? Someone who's been so loyal to our family." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Lila could hear her mother's breathing, soft but thoughtful. When Elise spoke again, her voice was calm, though Leela could sense the weight of her words. "Lila, sweetheart, I understand how you feel. I really do. But you have to understand something about your father." Elise's tone softened, and Lila could hear the familiar warmth, the softness that made her mother so different from her father. Victor is under an immense amount of pressure. He has so much responsibility, so many people relying on him, and sometimes he makes decisions that might not seem fair, but they come from a place of trying to protect all of us. He believes that if he shows weakness, it will affect everything he's worked so hard for. The business, the house, the lifestyle we live, it all depends on his ability to keep control. Lila's heart sank as her mother's words unfolded. She had always known that her father was burdened by the weight of his empire, but she had never imagined that this would be the excuse for his cruelty. She wanted to shout, to argue, to tell her mother that there was no justification for what had happened, that no amount of pressure could make it okay to treat another human being that way. But as much as she wanted to express her frustration, she held herself back, listening carefully to what her mother was saying. "I know it's hard to understand right now," Elise continued, "and I know it's difficult to see it from his side, especially when it feels like he's being unfair. But you have to remember that your father doesn't see things the way you do. He doesn't see kindness as a solution. In his mind, kindness is a distraction. He thinks he's doing what's best for everyone, even if it doesn't always seem that way." Leela felt a wave of frustration wash over her. "But Mom, I'm not asking him to be soft. I'm not asking him to give up everything he's built. I just want him to see that people, real people, matter. Mrs. Elena matters. Her life, her struggles, they're real. And he just dismissed them like they don't even exist. And I can't just stand by and let him do that, not anymore." She could feel the tears pricking at the corners of her eyes again, the rawness of the conversation cutting deeper than she had expected. "I know, Lila," Elise said, her voice softening. "I know. It's hard to see your father that way, to see him in a light that's different from how you've always known him. And I wish I could give you more answers, more help in changing his mind. But the truth is, sweetheart, you can't change someone else, not unless they want to change." Leela's heart ached as she listened to her mother's words. She had hoped that Elise would be the one to help her find a way to reach her father, to bridge the gap between them. But now, in the quiet of the conversation, she realized that her mother was as trapped in her own way of thinking as Victor was. She, too, saw the world through a lens of protection, of control, even if it meant tolerating the very things that Lila found so deeply wrong. "I know you want to make things right," Elise said gently. "And I know you want your father to see the way you do. But right now, you need to take care of yourself too. And sometimes that means stepping back. You've done your part, Lila. You've spoken your truth, and that's important. But sometimes we can't force people to see things differently. Lila sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of her mother's words sinking in. A deep ache spread through her chest, and she felt a knot in her stomach tighten. Was this really it? Was this the limit of what she could do? She had hoped for something more, something that would give her the strength to keep fighting. But instead, her mother's words felt like a door closing, a quiet acknowledgement that perhaps there was no room for her idealism in the world her father had built. "Mom," Leela whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I can't just let it go. I can't. It's wrong." "I know, sweetheart," her mother replied softly. "But sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is to hold onto your own heart, even when you can't change anyone else's." The conversation ended not with a solution, but with a sense of resignation, a quiet understanding that Lila's fight was one she would have to carry alone. Her mother's support, while comforting, wasn't enough to change the reality of the situation. But even as her mother's words echoed in her mind, Lila knew one thing for certain. She couldn't stop. Not now. Not when she knew what was right. She would find a way to make her father see. She would keep fighting, no matter how hard it seemed. She had to. The days following her conversation with her mother left Lila feeling more alone than ever. Her heart weighed heavy with the knowledge that, no matter how much she fought, she was stuck in a world where her father's beliefs were unshakable. It felt as though a silent barrier had grown between them, a wall Leela couldn't break through no matter how many times she tried to speak the truth. She had turned to her mother, hoping for comfort or guidance. But all she had received were words that, while meant to soothe, only deepened her frustration. Lila knew in her heart that her father would never see things the way she did, not unless something changed. But what? There was one thing, though, that Lila could do. It was late one evening, the sky outside the mansion turning dark and heavy with the weight of impending rain, when Lila made up her mind. She couldn't change her father. She couldn't convince him to have the empathy she felt was so necessary. But she could stand up for what was right in her own way. And she could make sure that Mrs. Elena knew that what had happened, what her father had done, wasn't her fault. That there was someone in this house who saw her, who understood. After dinner, when her father retreated to his study and the house fell into its usual quiet, Lila stood by the grand staircase, her heart pounding in her chest. Her decision had been made. She would go to Mrs. Elena's house. She would apologize on behalf of her father, even if it didn't erase the hurt, even if it didn't change the past. She would offer Mrs. Elena something she hadn't received that morning: kindness, understanding, and a promise that she wasn't invisible. Lila slipped quietly through the kitchen, avoiding the eyes of the staff, who were finishing their duties for the evening. She grabbed her coat from the mudroom and wrapped it tightly around her shoulders, the cool fabric a sharp contrast to the warmth of the mansion. The streets outside were slick with rain, but Lila didn't hesitate. She had made her decision. She wasn't sure how long it would take to walk to Mrs. Elena's small house. She had never made the trip herself, but it didn't matter. The thought of going back to her room, to the house that felt more like a prison with every passing day, was unbearable. She needed to do this, needed to know that there was still a chance to do something good, to right a wrong in a world that felt so broken. The walk to Mrs. Elena's modest home was long, and the rain began to fall more heavily, soaking through Lila's coat and hair as she trudged along the narrow streets. But the discomfort in her body did little to dampen the fire that burned in her chest. The cold and wetness were nothing compared to the feeling of helplessness she had experienced when she saw her father's cruelty. Nothing could compare to the weight of his rejection when she had tried to stand up for what was right. She would not be silenced. Finally, after what seemed like hours, Lila reached the small, worn house tucked at the end of a quiet street. The windows were dimly lit, a soft glow escaping from beneath the curtains. She paused at the front gate, her breath catching in her throat as she looked up at the humble structure that Mrs. Elena called home. It was so different from the vast mansion she had grown up in, with its polished floors and pristine surfaces. Mrs. Elena's house was small, older, worn by time and use, but it was hers. It was a place where she lived her life, where she had raised her family, and where she had cared for Lila's father for years. Lila hesitated for a moment before walking up the steps and knocking gently on the door. Her pulse quickened as she waited, the sound of her heartbeat loud in her ears. She wasn't sure what she would say to Mrs. Elena, but she knew she had to speak. The door creaked open, and there, standing in front of her, was Mrs. Elena. The woman's tired eyes met Lila's, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Mrs. Elena looked taken aback, her surprise evident as she stood in the doorway, the faint smell of something simmering in the kitchen lingering in the air behind her. "Lila?" she said softly, her voice hoarse, as if the weight of the day still clung to her. What? What are you doing here?" Lila swallowed, fighting the lump in her throat. The words felt like they might choke her. But she pushed them out anyway. "I came to see you. I wanted to apologize for what happened this morning. It wasn't right. What my father did, it wasn't right. And I'm sorry." Mrs. Elena blinked in surprise, her face unreadable for a moment. She stood there, unmoving, as if trying to process the sight of Lila standing before her on this rainy evening. It took a moment before she spoke again, her voice low and careful. "Lila, you don't need to apologize for your father's actions. What he did, that's not your fault." Lila shook her head, her hands trembling as she reached out slightly, as if trying to make Mrs. Elena see the sincerity in her heart. "No, it's not my fault, but it is his, and I want you to know that I see you, that I know you're not just a servant in this house. You're a person, a good person. You didn't deserve that, and I'm so sorry that it happened." The words tumbled out of her, raw and unfiltered, as if she had been holding them back for years, not just for days. She wanted Mrs. Elena to understand that she was not like her father. She wanted to prove that there was goodness left in the world, that there was someone who cared, even if the one person who should have didn't. For a moment, there was only silence. Mrs. Elena's eyes softened, and Lila saw something flicker behind them, a mix of surprise, gratitude, and something else, a quiet understanding. Then, before Lila knew what was happening, Mrs. Elena stepped forward, pulling her into a gentle embrace. The older woman's arms were warm, though slightly shaky, as if the act of being held had become foreign to her. Lila closed her eyes, allowing herself to lean into the comfort of the hug, feeling the weight of everything lift, even if just a little. "You are a good child, Lila," Mrs. Elena whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You don't know what it means for me to hear that. To know that there's someone who cares." Lila pulled back slightly, her eyes moist as she looked up at Mrs. Elena. "I'll make sure he knows. I'll make him see. I won't stop until he understands what he's done." Mrs. Elena gave her a sad smile, a faint trace of disbelief in her eyes. "You're a strong girl, Lila. You remind me so much of your mother. I don't know if you can change your father's heart, but don't ever lose your kindness. Don't ever let the world harden you." The words hung in the air, quiet but powerful, as Lila looked at the woman who had borne the weight of her father's cruelty for so many years. Mrs. Elena's eyes were filled with something Lila couldn't quite define, something between hope and resignation. But in that moment, Lila knew that her visit, her apology, had meant something. It had touched Mrs. Elena in a way that nothing else could. With a final, lingering hug, Layla turned to leave, but not without a promise. She would not rest. She would not give up on doing what was right, even if it meant standing alone. She couldn't change her father, but she could change the way the world around her saw him and herself. And that, Layla thought, as she walked back into the rain-soaked night, was a battle worth fighting. The morning after Lila's visit to Mrs. Elena's house, the mansion felt oddly quiet. The usual bustle of the household had a different tone, as though the very air inside the walls had shifted. Victor Renard, still wrapped in the weight of his routine and responsibilities, sat at his massive desk in his study, the faint glow of the early morning sun filtering through the windows. His hands rested on the polished surface of the desk, papers and contracts spread before him, but his mind wasn't on business, nor was it on the pile of work that awaited him. It was on Lila. The image of her, her eyes filled with defiance and concern, her voice shaking with emotion as she confronted him about Mrs. Elena, had haunted him throughout the night. He had dismissed her, of course. He had told her that discipline was the key to success, that the world didn't run on kindness, and that loyalty didn't excuse weakness. He had believed that for so long. But now, after hours of replaying the scene in his mind, something had started to crack inside him. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had been wrong. Lila had challenged him, and for the first time, he didn't know how to respond. His own daughter, the one person in this world who mattered most to him, had seen through the armor he had built around himself. And worse, she had seen through the excuse he had so long relied on, that his actions, his harshness, his unrelenting pursuit of control were justified by the pressures of his life. That somehow all of it was for her, for the family, for the future. But was it? Victor leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. His mind flashed back to the morning, to the scene that had unfolded with Mrs. Elena, and to the way he had reacted when she arrived late. He hadn't known about her husband's health issues, of course. He hadn't known about the personal struggles she had been facing. All he had seen was a small lapse in her otherwise flawless work ethic, and he had reacted as he always did, with cold, methodical punishment. He had raised his hand, struck her with that switch, and dismissed her without a second thought. He had made it about power, about control, about sending a message to everyone who worked for him. And for what? Victor's heart tightened as he thought of Mrs. Elena, the woman who had served his family loyally for years, who had endured the hardships of life with a quiet dignity. She had never once complained, never once asked for anything in return. And yet, he had treated her as though she were nothing more than a tool, a means to an end. The sting of that realization cut deeper than he had expected. He'd been so caught up in the idea that his way was the only way, that success required strict discipline, that he had lost sight of the humanity of those around him. But Lila, his daughter, the one person who truly understood him, had seen through it all. She had seen the truth of what he had done, and she had called him out on it. He had tried to brush her off, but her words had planted a seed, a small, uncomfortable doubt that had continued to grow inside him. What if she was right? What if kindness, compassion, and understanding were just as important as discipline, if not more? Victor stood from his desk abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. His thoughts were a whirlwind, but one thing was clear. He needed to make things right. Not just for Lila, but for Mrs. Elena, too. He couldn't let her live with the scars of his actions. He couldn't let his power define him any longer. He had to do something he had never done before, something he had always dismissed as a sign of weakness. He had to apologize, and he knew exactly where to start. The decision came to him suddenly, and with a certainty that surprised him. He didn't waste a moment. He left his study, striding through the mansion with purpose, his mind set on one goal, to find Mrs. Elena. The thought of seeing her again filled him with a strange mixture of guilt and determination. He had been cruel, yes, but the guilt was not enough to paralyze him. In fact, it drove him forward, and the closer he came to her modest home, the more he felt a heavy sense of responsibility to make things right. As he arrived outside her house, Victor paused. The rain from the previous night had stopped, but the air still felt thick with moisture. Mrs. Elena's home was just as small and simple as he remembered, but something about the quiet, humble atmosphere made him feel even more out of place. This was not his world. It was the world of those who lived with integrity, who valued loyalty not because it could be controlled, but because it was earned. He had lost sight of that, and now he needed to find it again. He knocked on the door, his breath coming in short, tight bursts. He had never done this before, not for anyone. But for Mrs. Elena, for his daughter, it was the only thing that made sense. After a long moment, the door opened, and there she stood. Mrs. Elena, her hair still slightly damp from the morning's rain, her face tired but soft in expression. When she saw who it was, her eyes widened slightly, and she took a small step back, clearly surprised by his presence. "Mr. Renard?" she asked, her voice unsure, almost hesitant. Victor swallowed, trying to calm the sudden flutter of nerves in his chest. This was harder than any business deal he had ever made, harder than any negotiation he had ever won. But it had to be done. He could not face himself or his daughter until he had done this. "I." His voice cracked and he paused to clear his throat. "Mrs. Elena, I've come to apologize for what happened yesterday, for the way I treated you." There was a long pause during which Mrs. Elena said nothing. Victor's heart began to race. Had he made a mistake? Should he have sent a letter, made an indirect apology through someone else? He had never done this before. Finally, Mrs. Alina spoke, her voice quiet but steady. "Mr. Renard, there's no need for you to." "I was wrong?" Victor cut in, the words spilling out faster than he intended. "You didn't deserve that. You've worked for us, for me, for so many years. You've always been kind, always been reliable, and I treated you with cruelty. I'm ashamed of myself. I should have been more compassionate. And I'm sorry." The sincerity in his voice seemed to surprise them both. Victor's chest tightened as he watched Mrs. Elena's face soften. She said nothing for a moment, her eyes scanning his face as though trying to read him, trying to decide if he was sincere. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she nodded slowly. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Thank you for saying that." Victor let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. The weight of his actions, the burden of his pride, had shifted just a little. He hadn't known if he could do this. He hadn't known if the apology would be enough, or if Mrs. Elena would even accept it. But he had to try. And in that moment, he realized that trying was enough. It was a step forward, something he hadn't taken in years. "I'll make things right," he promised, his voice steady now, though his heart still thudded in his chest. "I don't know if I can undo what I've done, but I'll do what I can. I will be more mindful. Of you, of others. I've learned something today. From my daughter, from you. And I won't forget it." Mrs. Elena nodded, her eyes glistening with something close to relief. "I believe you," she said softly, and for the first time in a long while, Victor felt like he had done something right. He turned to leave, feeling lighter, as though something inside him had finally shifted. Maybe it was just the beginning of change, or maybe it was a first step toward healing, both for him and for those he had wronged. But as he walked back to his car, something inside Victor Renard had undeniably changed. And for the first time in a long time, he wasn't just thinking about power, control, and success. He was thinking about something far more important: compassion. The day after Victor Renard's visit to Mrs. Elena's house, the change in him was palpable. At first, he was unsure of how to approach the rest of his day. It felt as though he had stepped into uncharted territory, a place where the old rules no longer applied, where his habitual need for control was being replaced by something altogether unfamiliar. But as he moved through his morning routine, as he dealt with his staff, and as he spoke with Lila at breakfast, he began to feel a sense of peace settle inside him, a peace he had not felt in years. He had apologized to Mrs. Elena. He had expressed regret, acknowledged his mistakes, and made a promise to be a better man, not just for her, but for himself, for Lila, and for his family. He could not change the past, but he could shape the future. And it was in that moment of vulnerability, of owning up to his faults, that Victor realized something powerful. It wasn't weakness to be kind, it was strength. Lila had watched her father closely in the days since the apology. She had noticed subtle shifts, small changes that made a world of difference. He no longer seemed so quick to anger, so ready to impose his will. There was a new patience in his voice, a new warmth in his gaze. He didn't dismiss her questions with the same icy detachment he once had. Instead, he listened, truly listened, as though her opinions mattered as much as anyone's. He even joked with her sometimes, the smile on his face not forced, but genuine. It was a side of him she had never seen, and it filled her with a quiet sense of hope. At breakfast that morning, Lila noticed something else. Her father was speaking to the staff with a newfound respect. He greeted the housekeepers by name, asking how their families were doing, offering small words of encouragement as they went about their duties. It wasn't much, but it was enough to show Lila that her father was beginning to understand the value of kindness. He had not forgotten the apology he had made to Mrs. Elena, and it seemed to be shaping the way he interacted with everyone around him. When the staff gathered for their morning briefing, Victor stood at the front of the room. His usual commanding presence softened. He addressed the group with a tone that was both respectful and considerate. "I want to apologize for any harshness I've shown in the past," he began, his voice steady but uncharacteristically humble. "I have not always led in the way I should have. I've been focused on results, on perfection, but I realize now that compassion, respect, and understanding are just as important. I expect excellence, but I also expect kindness. I will do my best to treat each of you as the people you are, not just as employees, but as individuals with your own lives, your own struggles. Thank you for your hard work. I appreciate everything you do." There was a moment of stunned silence in the room, a pause that felt like the collective breath of the household being held. Then, slowly, the staff began to nod, some even smiling, clearly moved by his words. Mrs. Elena, who was present at the briefing, looked up at him with a soft expression, her eyes betraying a quiet sense of gratitude. She had never expected to hear such words from him, not after everything that had happened. But there they were, and it was a beginning. Victor turned to leave, but before he did, he caught Lila's eye from across the room. She smiled at him, a warm, proud smile that made his chest tighten. He knew he still had a long way to go, but in that moment, he realized something important. The bond between father and daughter, built on honesty, compassion, and the willingness to grow, had never been stronger. That evening after dinner, as the household settled into the quiet hum of evening activity, Lila approached her father in the living room. She was hesitant at first, unsure of what to say, but Victor looked up at her with the same warmth in his eyes that she had come to recognize over the past few days. He patted the seat next to him on the couch, inviting her to sit. "I'm proud of you," she said softly, her voice filled with sincerity. Victor chuckled, the sound rich and genuine. "You are?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. He seemed almost surprised, as though he wasn't used to receiving such praise. But his expression softened as Lila nodded. "Yeah," she said, her voice quieter now. I think you're really trying to be different, and that means a lot. It's not easy to change, but you're doing it, and I'm proud of you." Victor leaned back in his chair, his heart swelling with an emotion he couldn't quite name. It wasn't just pride, it was gratitude. He had always thought of himself as the one in charge, the one who guided others. But now, in this moment, he realized that Lila had shown him something far more valuable than any business deal, any victory in the boardroom. She had shown him the power of compassion, the ability to change, to grow, and to rebuild what had been broken. "I've never been good at this," he admitted, his voice steady but humble. "But I'm trying, Lila. I want to be better. For you. For us." Lila smiled, her heart light. "I know you will be." For a long time, they sat together in the quiet, each of them reflecting on the changes that had unfolded in their lives. There were still challenges to face, still obstacles to overcome. But there was a sense of peace now that hadn't been there before. A sense that for the first time, they were all on the same path, moving forward together. The atmosphere in the Reynard household was never the same after that night. The walls that had once separated the members of the family, walls built on control, expectation, and distance, began to crumble. There was laughter at the dinner table, conversations that weren't about business, but about life. Victor learned to listen more than he spoke, to value not just results, but relationships. He no longer demanded perfection from those around him, but instead encouraged them to do their best, to grow, to improve. And for the first time in a long time, the Renard family felt like a family again. Mrs. Elena, too, noticed the change. The days that followed were marked by small acts of kindness, a morning greeting, a thank you for a job well done, a moment of understanding when something went wrong. It was as though the mansion had become a place where respect flowed both ways, where loyalty was earned not through fear, but through mutual appreciation. As time passed, Lila's pride in her father only grew. She had always loved him, but now she admired him in a way she never had before. He wasn't perfect, and he would never be, but he was trying. And that, Lila knew, was more than enough. He had learned at last that true power didn't lie in control. It lay in compassion, in understanding, and in the ability to change. And for the first time, she felt truly proud to call him her father. The family was healing, and the future, though uncertain, felt brighter than it ever had before. They had learned the true value of compassion, respect, and most importantly, the strength it took to be vulnerable and grow. And together, they would move forward, stronger, closer, and more united than ever before. The story of the Renard family is one of transformation and redemption. Through moments of pain and conflict, they learned that true power lies not in control, but in compassion and understanding. Victor, once cold and unyielding, came to realize that kindness was just as important as discipline. Lila, though young, found the courage to challenge the injustices she saw, sparking a change in her father. And Mrs. Alina, enduring years of hardship, showed them all the power of forgiveness and resilience. In the end, they discovered that growth comes not from perfection, but from the willingness to change, to listen, and to love. Their journey wasn't easy, but it led them to a place of greater understanding, where strength and compassion could coexist. Thank you so much for watching. We hope you enjoyed this story and found something meaningful in it. If you did, please like, comment, and subscribe to stay updated on more heartfelt stories. Share this video with friends or family who might appreciate it too. Your support means the world to us and helps us create more content that inspires and uplifts. Thank you for being part of our community.